You are about to hear what witches hoped you would never discover. These are the fasting laws they fear, the ones that expose them, disarm them, and force their attacks to collapse. An ex-witch has stepped forward not to entertain you, but to warn you. Because when you fast with these laws, the unseen world begins to shake. Strongholds crack. Hidden monitoring spirits scatter. And hell realizes you are no longer an easy target. Before an ex-witch ever fears your prayers, they fear your fasting, because prayer is your voice. But fasting is your authority. And the moment you combine the two, the spiritual world can no longer ignore you. Every witch who operated in the dark realm understands one thing. Fasting destabilizes their surveillance system. It blinds monitoring spirits. It shuts down spiritual informants. And it exposes every hidden hand touching your life. In the occult, the first thing witches memorize is how to watch you, how to track you, how to read your patterns, how to predict your emotions, how to locate your vulnerabilities. They operate like spiritual thieves waiting for an open window. But fasting is the moment you shut every window. You seal every door. You disconnect every spiritual camera pointed at your destiny. This is why the ex-witch said if Christians understood this one law, witchcraft would collapse overnight. So what is this law? It is the law of spiritual exposure through consecrated fasting. This law is simple yet devastating to darkness. When you fast, your spirit rises. When your spirit rises, your discernment sharpens. When discernment sharpens, the enemy loses secrecy. And when the enemy loses secrecy, he loses power. Warfare is not just about attacking. It's about seeing. You cannot defeat what you cannot detect. You cannot bind what you do not recognize. You cannot cast out what you cannot discern. Witches depend on your blindness. They thrive on your distractions. They rely on you being spiritually sleepy, emotionally overwhelmed, and mentally overloaded. Because a distracted believer is a vulnerable believer. But fasting pulls you out of the fog. It silences the noise. It breaks the emotional clutter. It disconnects you from the flesh so your spiritual senses become razor sharp. The ex-witch described it this way. In witchcraft, the greatest fear is not a praying Christian. It's a fasting Christian. Because fasting amplifies their spirit until they become impossible to hide from. When you fast, you activate spiritual vision behind the scenes. You begin to feel when something is wrong. You begin noticing patterns. You start sensing spiritual atmospheres. You wake up with warnings. You detect motives. You discern intentions. You see manipulation before it happens. You feel warfare before it begins. And this terrifies witches because they know their strongest weapon is deception. If deception fails, their entire system collapses. Let me take you deeper. In the occult, monitoring spirits, the ones assigned to watch you, are weakest during seasons of consecration. They become unstable. Their spiritual grip weakens. Their visibility increases. They are exposed like footprints in fresh snow. You begin to notice sudden emotional swings that weren't yours. You pick up atmospheres in certain rooms. You feel pressure in moments that used to feel normal. You sense resistance in conversations that used to be casual. You start realizing who is spiritually aligned with you and who is spiritually weaponized against you. This is not paranoia. This is discernment awakening. The ex-witch said something chilling. The fastest way to expose a spiritual attack is not prayer alone. It is fasting, because fasting forces everything hiding to come into the light. Think of it like this. Prayer shines a flashlight, but fasting turns on the floodlights. You don't see bits and pieces. You see the entire battlefield. You see where the attack started. You see who was connected to it. You see how long it had been operating. You see where the breach came from. You see the door you forgot to close. You see the emotional area the enemy has been using against you. You see the spiritual weakness you must confront. Fasting reveals the roots behind the fruit. And nothing terrifies witches more than a believer who can see the root. Because once you see the root, you can uproot it. Once you see the origin, you can shut it down. Once you see the unseen, you can dismantle the entire attack. Let me give you a real example the ex-witch shared. She described a Christian woman who kept having the same spiritual attacks every month: nightmares, confusion, strange anxiety, sudden losses, emotional heaviness. She prayed, yet nothing changed. But the moment she entered a real fast, something shifted. On the third day, she suddenly felt clarity. She saw the pattern. She identified the timing. She recognized the spiritual source. She discerned the person connected to the attack. She saw the spiritual cycle for what it was: a monthly assignment. That same week, the entire cycle broke. Why? Because fasting exposed the surveillance system that had been watching her for months. Once she saw it, she shut it down. And once it was shut down, the attacks could no longer find her. This is the power of the first fasting law. Fasting exposes what's been attacking you. You cannot defeat a hidden enemy. You cannot overcome what remains unseen. But when fasting reveals it, the enemy loses his advantage. Every witch depends on staying unnoticed. They work through secrecy, silence, and shadows. But fasting turns the shadows into daylight. It strips away the camouflage. It forces the spiritual realm to become visible. You begin to recognize attack patterns. You discern emotional manipulation. You feel spiritual monitoring when it enters a room. You sense dark atmospheres that were previously normal. You pick up on shifts that others ignore. You detect spiritual activity without being told. This is why witches fear fasting. Fasting gives you the sight they hoped you would never use. This is why your dreams intensify during fasting. This is why your inner warnings become louder. This is why your spiritual instincts sharpen. This is why your discernment becomes crystal clear. This is why the wrong people suddenly become uncomfortable around you. They cannot hide anymore. The ex-witch said it best. When a believer begins to fast, every demon assigned to them begins to panic, because they know their days of hiding are over. You may not even pray long hours. You may not shout. You may not use fancy words. But the moment you fast, the spiritual realm recalibrates around you. Things that were hidden become exposed. Things that were confusing become clear. Things that were silent become loud. Things that were disguised become obvious. Fasting gives you spiritual X-ray vision. It reveals the structure of the attack. It shows you the enemy's blueprint. It exposes the spiritual trap before you step into it. It reveals the spiritual ambush waiting around the corner. And once you see it, you break it. This is why this law terrifies witches. Fasting removes their invisibility. And the moment a witch loses invisibility, they lose influence. Once they lose influence, they lose control. Once they lose control, their assignments collapse. This is the first fasting law, the law of exposure, the law that strips darkness of secrecy, the law that forces every hidden thing to surface. And now that you know it, you will never fast the same way again. Now that you understand how fasting exposes the enemy, it is time to learn the next terrifying truth. There is a law within fasting that does not just reveal attacks, it destroys them. It dismantles strongholds that have held your life hostage for years. It fractures the walls that witches and dark spirits have built to contain your destiny. The ex-witch said something chilling. Most Christians pray and fast without realizing that. Strongholds are built like fortresses. You cannot simply knock on the door. You have to tear the walls down. Every stronghold begins with consent, even if you never consciously gave it. Generational curses, repeated sin, fear, doubt, and hidden agreements allowed it to grow. These strongholds anchor demons. They house oppression. They command influence over your life, finances, relationships, health, and mind. And here is what witches fear when you fast with intentionality. You begin dismantling every wall of their stronghold. Because fasting weakens the spiritual structures that darkness relies on. It attacks the very foundation of the enemy's assignments. Let me explain this further. When you fast, your spiritual strength increases. Your faith becomes sharper. Your prayers begin to carry weight. And as your spiritual weight rises, strongholds cannot withstand it. This is why the ex-witch warned, nothing terrifies witches more than a fasting Christian who is relentless, consistent, and unwavering. Because a fasting believer moves like an unstoppable force. Strongholds often appear invisible to the naked eye. You may not see oppression manifest immediately. You may not recognize the chain behind habitual problems. But fasting shines light on it. It brings hidden bondage to the surface. It attacks it from the inside. There is a law at work here, and it is not optional. It is the law of spiritual dismantling through fasting. The law works like this. Day 1, fasting begins to weaken the enemy's perimeter. Day 2, the inner lies and manipulations start to crumble. Day 3, spiritual attacks may intensify temporarily. This is the enemy fighting for survival. Day 4, realignment begins. Chains begin breaking. Day 5, strongholds lose power. You begin to reclaim authority. Day 6 and beyond, the enemy loses ground, influence wanes, and freedom expands. You see, fasting is not passive. It is warfare in action. It is spiritual demolition. It is the sword that pierces invisible chains. It is the fire that melts strongholds from within. The ex-witch revealed this truth with blunt clarity. When a Christian fasts according to the laws of God, strongholds collapse faster than witches can react, because you attack the foundation, not just the symptoms. Here is a real-life example. A man had struggled with repeated failures in business and financial attacks for over 5 years. He prayed consistently, but saw little change. An ex-witch revealed to him that the enemy had built a stronghold around his finances. She instructed him to fast with focused prayer on that stronghold. By the 4th day of fasting, he began to receive unexpected business opportunities. By the 7th day, debts began clearing. By the 10th day, former financial obstacles dissolved as if by divine intervention. The stronghold that had silently controlled his life was gone shattered by the law of fasting. This is the law witches fear. Fasting attacks the fortress before you even lift a hand. They rely on hidden chains, invisible doors, and spiritual locks. They depend on your unawareness. They pray you will remain passive. But fasting flips the battlefield. It is why spiritual warfare cannot succeed without fasting. Prayer alone engages the enemy. Fasting demolishes the enemy's fortifications. Prayer calls the fire. Fasting brings the earthquake. You must understand, strongholds are not only external, they are internal. Fear, doubt, resentment, bitterness, generational curses, addictive patterns, all of these are strongholds. And fasting is the law that shatters them. Many Christians fail to fast because of the temporary discomfort. They fear hunger. They fear weakness. They fear isolation. But these fears are exactly what witches exploit. They know that the moment you endure discomfort for spiritual power, they lose influence. Every chain they placed begins to snap. Every wall they built begins to crumble. This law teaches a key principle. Your body is a battlefield, and your obedience is the weapon. Fasting is not about denying yourself. It is about empowering your spirit. It is about breaking limitations that have kept you trapped. It is about activating authority that has been dormant. The ex-witch shared one last warning. Strongholds fear consistency more than anything else. A 1-day fast may make a ripple. A 3-day fast may cause tremors. A 7-day fast will bring collapse. If the believer persists, there is no wall the enemy can rebuild fast enough. Do not underestimate this law. Do not treat fasting as ritual. Do not pray half-heartedly. Every moment of fasting, every prayer and discipline, every ounce of persistence attacks the very stronghold the enemy hoped would remain permanent. This is why witches dread fasting Christians, because fasting targets the root, not the symptom. Because fasting destroys the fortress, not the fence. Because fasting liberates what has been chained for generations. So hear this clearly: when you fast, every hidden stronghold trembles. Every secret assignment feels the pressure. Every curse and chain begins to unravel. And freedom begins to manifest in your life in ways that cannot be ignored. This is the second fasting law, the law of stronghold collapse. Once you understand it, you will never approach fasting casually again, because you will know that every disciplined hour, every moment of prayer, hunger, is a blow against the forces that sought to keep you powerless. There is a reason witches can curse some Christians easily and cannot even touch others. It has nothing to do with personality, nothing to do with intelligence, nothing to do with background or church attendance. It is authority. And authority is not something you shout. It's something you carry, something that rests on you, something that radiates from your spirit like a fire that cannot be ignored. This is the fasting law witches fear the most, the law of irresistible spiritual authority. The ex-witch said something that should shake you. There are Christians witches avoid, not because they pray louder, but because their spirit carries a weight that cannot be confronted. This weight, this spiritual density, comes from fasting. Not casual fasting, not occasional fasting, not fasting because everyone else is doing it, but fasting that builds your inner man until the enemy recognizes your voice, your presence, your commands, and responds with fear. You must understand this. Darkness is legalistic. Demons do not respond to emotion. They do not respond to volume. They do not respond to complaints or tears. They respond to authority. And fasting increases your authority in a way prayer alone never could. Here's why: when you fast, your flesh weakens, but your spirit strengthens. Your distractions fade, but your clarity amplifies. Your anxieties lower, but your faith rises. And when your faith rises, your spiritual weight increases. And when your spiritual weight increases, darkness cannot resist you. This is why Jesus said, "This kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting." He wasn't talking about intensity. He was talking about authority. He was talking about spiritual ranking. He was talking about power that cannot be denied. Witches know this. The ex-witch revealed, when a Christian begins to fast seriously, the kingdom of darkness updates their spiritual ranking. Your name becomes known. Your presence becomes recognized, and your authority becomes feared. This is why certain attacks suddenly stop during fasting. Why certain people pulling you into spiritual traps begin to retreat. Why certain temptations lose power. Why certain demonic atmospheres break. Not because you prayed harder, but because you stepped into a higher level of authority. The ex-witch described the spiritual effect this way: when a believer fasts, a fire forms around them. Demons feel the fire before the believer even speaks. They know the attack will fail before it begins. This fire is not emotional. It's not symbolic. It's not psychological. It is spiritual authority radiating from a consecrated spirit. Let me take you deeper. Authority in the spirit realm functions like sound frequency. Some voices echo with no weight, demons ignore them. Others carry weight, demons listen but resist. And then there are voices forged in fasting. Voices that carry such density that demons flee before the command is finished. This is why witches tremble when a believer begins fasting with intention. Because fasting increases your spiritual jurisdiction. It enlarges your territory. It expands your reach. It multiplies your impact. Your authority becomes like a spiritual signature. Witches know when a believer's signature has shifted. They sense when your spirit man has risen. They feel when you have stepped into a realm they cannot challenge. The ex-witch confessed, "There were believers I was forbidden to attack, not because they prayed louder, but because their fasting life made them untouchable." Untouchable. A word witches do not use lightly. A word that defines believers who walk with such spiritual authority that curses bounce off them like dust in the wind. This is what fasting does. It builds an atmosphere around you that darkness cannot penetrate. It places a mantle on your spirit that witches cannot counterfeit. It puts a shield around your life that cannot be bypassed. You become spiritually unapproachable. Let me give you a real story the ex-witch shared. There was a Christian man who always struggled with spiritual attacks, nightmares, oppression, fear, constant stagnation. He prayed often, but nothing shifted. Then he decided to begin a serious fasting journey. The first 3 days were difficult. His emotions resisted. His body complained. His mind wandered. But by the 6th day, something changed. He woke up with a spiritual boldness he had never felt. His prayers carried strength. His words had weight. His authority expanded. Within a week, the nightmares stopped. Within 2 weeks, patterns of oppression dissolved. Within a month, every attack that once tormented him disappeared. Why? Because his fasting life elevated his spiritual ranking. He became a threat. He became a fire. He became a voice demons did not want to challenge. This is the fasting law which is fear the most, not the hunger, not the discipline, not the devotion, but the authority fasting produces. Authority that shifts atmospheres. Authority that breaks curses. Authority that silences demonic voices. Authority that commands submission in the unseen realm. Authority that establishes victory before the battle even begins. This law is simple but terrifying to darkness. You cannot be cursed when your authority outranks the curse. Witches know this. Demons know this. Hell knows this. A believer walking in fasting-powered authority is like a lion entering a territory of insects. The insects may buzz, but they cannot bite. They may resist, but they cannot overcome. They may attack, but they cannot succeed. Your presence becomes a declaration. I am covered. I am empowered. I am not the same. This is why witches panic when a believer begins to fast intentionally. Because fasting lifts your spiritual authority into a realm they cannot touch. The ex-witch put it plainly. When a Christian fasts, they don't just survive spiritual warfare, they dominate it. And this is the third fasting law, the law of irresistible spiritual authority. A law that breaks curses before they form. A law that silences witches before they speak. A law that commands demons before they manifest. A law that places you in a realm where darkness cannot challenge you. When you walk in this authority, you become spiritually untouchable. And witches know it. You are not weak. You are not outnumbered. You are stepping into a level of spiritual authority that darkness cannot resist. Every fast you begin from this day forward will ignite fire around your life. Every prayer will carry weight. Every command will strike with power, and every battle will end in your victory.